Go ahead and grab your Bibles and open up to Luke chapter 22. If you don't have a Bible that you could read and understand, there's some paperback ones at the ends of the rows. Grab those suckers, pass them down, and seriously, snag one and take it home with you. Feel free to jot some notes down as we go about this today. If you're hanging out with us online, we're going to be using the NIV version for most of this morning. And today we're going to continue on in our second week of this series that we're calling Crash the Chatterbox. And something that I wanted to share with you, something that I have discovered. I have not counted my own thoughts, but psychologists who have done studies on this, and there are conflicting numbers, but we can work with averages this morning. Psychologists say that we as human beings have on average 60,000 thoughts per day. And of those 60,000 thoughts, over 80% of those are negative. Now, like I said, I've not counted my own, but I know that my mind can get running pretty quickly with some negative thoughts that are definitely not helpful, right? Like they're at least, at bare minimum, they're at least not helpful. And although I don't believe just telling yourself, I know I can or I've got this will help you get through whatever it is that you're facing, I do know that our minds can be this endless chatterbox, this endless recording of badgering that plays on repeat, and it runs you ragged, it wears you out, and it can take seemingly the most insignificant incident or the most insignificant piece of information and turn it into the thing, the weapon that will destroy you. I want to give you just a little bit of an example of how my chatterbox will run and play. In fact, this happened just yesterday with, well, not this exact event, but what I'm about to describe to you. I've written down what one of my internal monologues have been when I find myself facing my chatterbox. For a really long time, I've done really well when I get home to take my glasses off and place them on what we call the crap catcher. You guys have crap catchers in your house? It just kind of like catches everything. So I get home, and I've done a really good job for a long time of taking my glasses off and putting them in the same place on our crap catcher. But for some reason, and I don't know why, but for some reason lately, I've done a really poor job of that, and I've started taking my glasses off in really random places throughout the house. And then inevitably what happens is I need my glasses for something. Not having my glasses is not going to work. And so it leads me on this wild goose chase throughout the house trying to remember where it was I set my glasses down. And that's when my chatterbox begins to play. And I just wanted to show you, this is how the conversation usually goes. It goes something like this inside my own head. Curtis, you know you always lose this stuff. What is wrong with you? You know you need to put it down in the right place, but no, you were in a hurry. Why were you in a hurry again, Curtis? Oh, yeah, because you were late. You're always late. You told your kids you'd play with them in 5 minutes. It's been 25. You equal bad dad. And so then I go, and you know who else? Who knows? You know who else knows that it's been 25 minutes and not just 5? Your wife, Abby. She knows it's been 25. She knows that you are late. Bad dad equals lame husband as well. How can you expect your kids to grow up and keep their word when you can't even keep yours? And so then I run, it gets me moving a little bit faster, looking around downstairs. I can't find it, so eventually I move upstairs. And as I run through the house, I see the litany of things that need to be fixed around the house. There's a light bulb that's out. That drywall needs fixed. That faucet's leaking, which, oh, by the way, Curtis, is costing you a bunch of money as it drips. I need to write some of this down. My clothes need hung. And when was the last time that we vacuumed this room? I need to put this down on a list so I can make sure they get this done. I need to put this list in my phone. Where is my phone? You are so forgetful. Speaking of forgetful, why did you come up here in the first place? Oh, yeah, my glasses. I'm never going to get all this done. I mean, I can't even put my glasses where I can find them. Guess I'll go back downstairs and keep looking there. And sooner or later, I always find my glasses, and if I'm totally honest with you this morning, usually Abby, my wife, finds my glasses. But usually, sooner or later, I find them, but so the chatterbox goes, right? Our head just gets spinning with these thoughts, and it's like wherever I go, this voice is always with me. It's this voice of doubt. Can I do this? Right? What makes you think you can do this? It's this voice of condemnation. Hey, remember the last time? Remember when you did this? It's a voice of discouragement. You can't, you won't, you'll never. It creates insecurity that steals peace. It creates anxiety within me that steals my joy. It creates fear that steals my hope. And if I'm honest with you, and I think if you were honest with me, it just makes me so tired. And if I happen to not be tired of hearing the voice, I find myself angry at it, but it seems the angrier I get at the voice, or the more tired I am at the voice, the more the chatterbox starts rattling. And all of this keeps me from moving forward to love God and be who He created me to be. And so in this series, we're going to crash the chatterbox. What we're looking at is we really have a choice. And our choice is, are we going to listen to the chatterbox or are we going to listen to God? Jesus, He describes Satan this way in the Bible. John 8:44 says this. It says, He, Satan, was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language. He is fluent in deception. For he is a liar and the father of lies. What Jesus is saying there, man, when it comes to Satan, all things false come from Satan. All lies are born from Satan. Satan's best weapon against you, against me, against us is deception. He is the father of lies. He is the chatterbox. Contrast that with how Jesus describes himself a little bit later in John 14. John 14, verse 6, he says this, I think. John 14, verse 6, he says, Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So Jesus says, I'm the truth. I have the words of life. Everything that is true ultimately comes from Jesus. Now, as you if we were to zoom out just a little bit from the Bible and look at all the times where Satan is described in the Bible, the word that is most commonly used to describe Satan is this word adversary. An opponent, someone you're up against in battle, which means that we're up against him in a contest, a conflict, a dispute. And then if you contrast that with the word that is most commonly used to describe Jesus' spirit, right? Jesus promises that he was going to send us a helper to those who will put their faith in Jesus and are baptized. And the word that he uses there to describe his Holy Spirit is this word advocate. And an advocate is a person who publicly supports someone. Right? He's a supporter, a backer, a champion, someone who go to bat for someone else. And so what we're looking at in this series is that we have a choice. Are we going to listen to Satan and his lies, or are we going to listen to Jesus and the words of life and truth? Are we going to listen to the adversary, or are we going to listen to the advocate? I mean, and it's so crazy important which voice you decide to believe, because the voice that you believe is going to determine the future that you are going to experience. Right, because they both want different things for you, right? The adversary's got a whole different set of hopes, goals, and dreams for you than Jesus does. And so the voice that you believe will determine the future that you experience. And here's the deal. This is just I was like, man, we just got to have kind of a quick honest moment about this. When Dan, our lead minister, and I, when we sit down, we start thinking about what series we're going to do and things that we are going to talk about, we read a ton of books, spend a lot of time in the Bible, praying, listening to podcasts, other messages and things like that, and for what we're going to talk about on Sunday morning. And I have known about this series. This is a book written by a guy named Stephen Furtick. I've known about this series for several different years. And I have, honestly, to be honest with you, I've avoided doing this series like the plague. And one of the biggest reasons, actually the biggest reason, is because I have been struggling with my chatterbox big time, and I just cannot seem to get a handle on it. And it just seems like it feels silly, because I should be able to get a handle on it and tell myself, hey, be quiet and move on, but it's been more difficult than that. And here's the reality. Here at Momentum, we don't say I can't. We say I need help. I need help. Right? And so it's time that I stop listening to myself and start listening to what Jesus has to say. And I thought that maybe we could learn about this together. And so if you find that this series really speaks to you, you may be really interested in going and checking out this book as well. But a goal for this series is for us to be able to break free from the chatterbox that's constantly chirping in our ear and tune in to the words of life from Jesus. And so today we're going to try and conquer our adversary, the chatterbox, when it comes to our shame and our guilt. And the way I want to do that this morning is I want to quickly recap the tale of two men in our Bible. The tale of two men, just parts of their story in Luke 22. In Luke 22, we meet our first guy. Luke 22, starting in verse 1, here's what happens before we meet Judas. Luke 22, verse 1, it says, "Now the festival of unleavened bread, called Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people." Okay, now, so this feast of unleavened bread, this Passover, all right, this is a big feast for Judaism, where Jews from all over the known world at the time would gather into Jerusalem. And what's really important to know about that is that means that Jesus would be there. Now, Jesus at the time had been teaching for a while, and Jesus had really been calling out the religious leaders and the authorities for not doing a good job of loving people. We're going to see an example of that here in just a little bit. Jesus was telling them, hey, you guys aren't doing well at loving God because you're not doing well at loving the people that are around you. And as Jesus called the religious leaders out for that, they saw their power and their authority and their wealth begin to slip away because the people stopped following them and started following Jesus. And so they got really jealous of Jesus, and they wanted to do something in order to try and take Jesus out. But they couldn't because they were afraid of the people, the crowds. They knew that if they went and took Jesus while the crowds were around, that there would be an uprising. And so they needed something else. They needed someone else. They needed someone on the inside, someone who could sell them out. And that's where we meet Judas. Judas comes in verse 3 of Luke 22. It says this, "Then Satan, the adversary, the chatterbox, entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard, and he discussed with them how he might betray Jesus." Now, there's a lot of talk, and a lot of scholars spend time, looking at what does it look like here when it says Satan entered Judas. Is this like some sort of like possession thing that we would see in like an exorcism movie? Is this maybe just how Judas like always was? Was he always not really a friend of Jesus? Personally, what I think happened here, I think in this moment, Judas started listening to the chatterbox. I think he started to listen to the adversary. You see, when Judas started following Jesus, it seems as though he was all in. And Jesus was talking about this great kingdom that he was going to set up. And Judas, I think, begins to think Jesus is going to set up this physical kingdom. And Jesus is going to be the king. And that means that I, Judas, am going to get all the power and wealth and authority that being one of the king's right-hand man comes with. But as he hung out with Jesus, he saw that's not what Jesus was talking about at all. And I think Satan, the adversary, the chatterbox, starts whispering in Judas's ear, "You're not getting what you deserve." And he started listening to that. "You're not getting what you deserve." He listened to the chatterbox. And so then he begins to look for an opportunity to betray Jesus. The conversation started. A deal is struck, money is exchanged, and then we have verse 6 of Luke 22 where it says this, "He, Judas, consented." He agreed to their terms, and he watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. He sells them out. And a little bit later, Judas is with Jesus at this Passover feast. And for Passover feast, I want you to picture like Thanksgiving dinner. That's kind of like what it was for them. So just all of them sitting around this big table. They got this big meal. They're going to eat. They're going to talk. They're going to hang out for a while. And in the middle of all the chaos of eating and hanging out and talking together, Jesus gets everyone's attention and he says, "Hey, just so you guys are aware, someone sitting at this table with me tonight is going to betray me. Someone is selling me out." And so naturally, in the middle of this room, the conversation turns to that. Is it me? Is it me? Is it you? Is it you? Is it you? And you can imagine the kind of the chaos and the different conversations that break out in the different sections of the room. And then Jesus appears to have just a quiet moment to what seems like just between him and Judas and maybe the two people sitting on either side of him. And in the middle of all this happening, as Jesus has just revealed, someone has sold me out, Jesus leans over to Judas and he says, "I know what you did. What you do, go and do quickly." And so Judas gets up. He goes out, and he finds the chief priests and the elders, and he begins to put in motion to sell Jesus out. And so Judas goes, and perhaps maybe you know the rest of the story. A short while later, Jesus is condemned for a crime he did not commit, and he's sentenced to be executed on the cross. And in that moment, guilt finds its way, right? And it settles down right on top of Judas. And he is now feeling that weight of that guilt. And it says that he actually goes back to the men who he gave him money, and he tried to return it, realizing he messed up, because Matthew 27:4 says this. Matthew 27:4. Uh-oh. It says, I have sinned, he declared, for I have betrayed an innocent man. So Judas goes and he tells them, hey, look, guys, I messed up. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I've sinned. I've betrayed an innocent man. He goes back. He goes back to the religious leaders to try and deal with his guilt. Now, here's our example, and it shows us just how bad these religious leaders were at caring for and loving for people. Here you have this man who's carrying this weight of this guilt. He goes back to the religious leaders and says, I have sinned. I've betrayed an innocent man. And what do they say to him? Look what they say. They say this, the end of verse 27, it says, what do we care? They retorted, that's your problem. And so all of a sudden, guilt now defines Judas. And perhaps, to me, one of the saddest stories in the Bible plays out from this point, because Judas goes out from here and he takes his own life, commits suicide. Now listen, Judas goes and he takes his own life because he felt shame and he felt guilt after betraying Jesus. He thought, this is who I am. I am a betrayer. That's all I will ever be. He messed up and he allowed it to define him. Right? But not every person, this is important to note, this is not a sermon on suicide, but we would be absolutely remiss if we did not spend some time talking about it. Not every person who commits suicide is doing so because of a mistake. But what is important to know is that shame does directly correlate to suicide. And burying shame is an epidemic in our culture right now. And burying shame is an epidemic in our church, especially when it comes to issues like mental health. Last August 2018, a pastor named Andrew Stockling of Inland Church took his own life. He was 30. And Inland Church was impacting the community. It had thousands of members. Andrew wasn't upset because of a failing church. Andrew wasn't responding to some sin against him or some sin that he did. What we find out now, because his wife, she's talking about things, Andrew struggled for years with mental health, and he had done so for a long time. And it is heartbreaking and heart-wrenching to see the things that he went through that his wife is now talking about behind closed doors. Perhaps many of you saw posts about him on Facebook. Man, the church has got to be a place that is leading the conversation, leading the way in caring for people who struggle with mental illness. But instead, a lot of times church is a place of shame for people who are battling depression, anxiety, bipolar, and much more. And so oftentimes it becomes that place because we're not really sure what to do. And so we don't say anything. And in the absence and in our silence, when we say nothing, we end up creating an environment of shame instead of trying to help. You know, the number of suicides in the United States has increased 24% from 1999 to 2014. Since 2006, the increase each year has jumped between 1% and 2%, according to the CDC. And the biggest jump is always between adolescent girls and middle-aged men. Pastor Stephen Austin, who attempted suicide a few years ago, he wrote that suicide is an epidemic that is squeezing the life out of our families, our churches, and our communities. Suicide respects no one. And the stigma surrounding mental illness, especially Christian communities, keeps people locked in these prisons of shame where they refuse to admit that they need help. We have got to create a culture where it is okay to ask for help. And if there's one thing Judas' story can point us to, is that followers of Jesus can and do struggle with mental illness. People need to know that they are not alone, and you can still be a follower of Jesus and have a mental illness. Pastor Tony Rose, he said a depressed person is convinced that no one has ever felt the way that they feel. And so if you're here this morning and carrying some shame because of mental illness, I want you to know you do not have to feel like you are alone. You do not have to feel and carry shame by yourself. You do not have to feel shame because of that. You do not need to feel shame because you need to take medicine this morning because your anxiety levels of being here on Sunday morning creates panic attacks. You do not need to feel shame because of that. You do not need to feel shame because people ignorantly believe that mental health issues come from a mistake that you have made in your past. You do not need to feel shame because of that. You do not need to feel shame because you have really high highs and really low lows and you have no idea how to control them or why they happen. You do not need to feel shame because of those things. This church Momentum will never make you feel shame because of that. You are not alone. You do not need to feel shame, and the leaders of this church want nothing more than to come alongside of you, pray for you, support you, and help you, and listen to you. So you no longer have to find yourself or feel like you are locked in a prison of shame. Okay? Judas messes up. All right, and he goes and he looks for help, and he doesn't find help when he looks for it. And so what happens is he chooses to let guilt define him. He chooses to be defined by guilt. And so now what I want to do is I want to rewind a little bit, and I want to talk about another person that was present and ends up finding guilt as a result of that same Thanksgiving feast that they were all sitting down together. Now, during that same dinner, after Jesus had told them, hey, someone at this table is going to betray me, Jesus has another moment with a guy named Simon Peter as well. And perhaps maybe you've heard this story. One of our elders, Mike Love, just preached on it a couple weeks ago. And so after he tells everybody, hey, someone sitting at this table is going to betray me, Jesus says this to Simon Peter. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. He says, all of you sitting at this table, Satan has asked, the adversary, the Chatterbox, has asked to work you over, all of you, to sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, and he hones in here on Simon Peter. He says, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Now, this is another sermon for another time, but I want to point out something here. Jesus prays specifically that Simon Peter will not fail. But as we talk through the story, and if you already know the story, what do you know? You know Simon still does fail. And what does that point out? Even Jesus prayed prayers that he got to answer no to. Now, that's, like I said, another sermon for another time. But then he goes and he tells Peter, and when you have turned back, that you will strengthen your brothers. And then when Jesus says this to Peter, what we do, Peter does exactly what we would do. Are you kidding me, Jesus? Heck no. Look, to prison and to death, if that's what it comes to. That's what Peter says when he says this. I pray that when you turn back, Peter, that you will strengthen your brothers. Peter says, I ain't turning back. I'm with you, Jesus, to prison and to death, if that's what it comes to. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, Peter, man, look, I'm telling you, before the night's over, you're going to deny that you even spent time with me 3 times. If you know the story, that's exactly what happens. Jesus is spot on. Peter goes and he denies Jesus 3 times. And just as he emphatically denies Jesus the 3rd time, spending any time with Jesus the 3rd time, the rooster crows and Peter looks up and he just so happens to make eye contact with Jesus, who's in the middle of this mess, and guilt finds its way and it settles down right on top of Peter. And Luke 22:62 says this, and he went outside and wept bitterly because guilt and shame has now settled down on Peter's shoulders. And what is he going to do with it? And so there's kind of a blank spot here in Peter's story. Something happened because Peter ends up back reconnected with the other apostles. He ends up reconnected with the other followers of Jesus. And I want to know what that first conversation consisted of. Because personally, I think Peter went back and I think he tried to deny his guilt even some more. He tried to deny his denial. Hey, Peter, what happened with Jesus as he gets, I don't know. I don't know. And then I wonder if maybe one of the followers of Jesus just so happened to oversee Peter's denial. And he said, no, wait a minute, Peter. I saw you. That little girl said that you spent time with Jesus, and you said you didn't even know him. I wonder how hard Peter tried to deny his guilt. But sooner or later, Peter owns his guilt. Sooner or later, Peter owns his guilt. And then 3 days later, when Jesus comes back from that, he ends up getting some one-on-one time with Jesus. And here, Peter experiences grace from Jesus. He experiences mercy from Jesus. And because of that, Peter finds a way to deal with his guilt. And Peter becomes the main person in leading the founding of the church. And at his very first sermon, 3,000 people were baptized. Now, here's the thing that we can't get around with both Judas and Peter, right? Both men were guilty, right? They both were guilty, but they did not respond to their guilt the same way. Judas let guilt define him. Peter, for a little while, I think, tried to deny his guilt. And how we deal with guilt is a really big deal. Proverbs 14:9 says this, says that fools make fun of guilt, but the godly acknowledge it and seek reconciliation. Fools make fun of guilt, but the godly acknowledge it and seek reconciliation. Guilt is the emotion that is associated with acknowledging we've done something wrong. And there's lots of different types of guilt, right? There's false guilt, which is where you feel bad for something you didn't do, or you did something, but it really wasn't as bad as you feel like it is. That's false guilt. We're not talking about false guilt this morning. This morning we're talking about real guilt. This morning we're talking about real shame, real guilt. You hurt someone, right? You took something from someone. And now you feel that guilt because of that, because you can't give that back. And then you allow it to then lower your value. And you feel the shame as a result of that. That's real guilt. There's also stuffed guilt, right? Stuffed guilt is that thing where we do something wrong. And I think sometimes like that we did something wrong and it was so bad that we stuff it and try and pretend like it's not, like it didn't happen or it wasn't us. Right? Or it happened so long ago that we retreat to a narrative to try and justify why we did it, right? And we've all got a narrative. We've all got different narratives. Our narratives usually go something like this. Well, it wasn't just me, right? I wasn't the only one. They participated too. Well, I was only 20. Okay, I was 25, but I was only in my 20s. Right? My dad was that way. My granddad was that way. I guess it's just my family. Like we create this narrative that allows us to distance ourselves from our guilt, and we suppress it. But here's the thing that we have learned from psychology, and really it's just pointing to wisdom that God has tried to highlight for us way back in Proverbs, right? Denying guilt or being defined by guilt always empowers your guilt. Right? I mean, that's Proverbs 14:9. Fools make fun of guilt. Fools deny guilt. Fools bury guilt. But the wise acknowledge it and seek reconciliation. Denying guilt or being defined by guilt always empowers our guilt. It turns the chatterbox up to where that's all that you can hear. And here's the thing. All of this throws us off balance, right? And we've created language about this because guilt in us, guilt creates a debt-debtor relationship. We've created language about this. My youngest daughter, Berkeley, she's 2, and she's going on 19, and she's learned she's got an opinion, and she's learned that she can have a really strong opinion, and sometimes that strong opinion will lead her to do something to physically hurt one of her other sisters. And when that happens, because we're trying to be good parents, we pull her aside and say, hey, you did this, you can't do that, and then what do we say? You owe them an apology. You get it? Guilt creates that debt-debtor relationship. But see, here's the thing. When we are guilty, we do not experience guilt as a debt-debtor relationship, right? We experience guilt as a weight. Right? Think about it. When you've hurt someone or you've had this thing kind of looming over your head for a long time, and then you finally get the chance to sit down and resolve and reconcile the situation, what do we finally say? Oh, man, I just feel like a weight has been lifted off of me. You see, and because we feel it like a weight, it throws us off balance. Right? Guilt throws us off balance in our relationships. It can throw you off balance in your parenting. It can throw you off balance in how you talk to your parents or your teachers. It can throw you off balance in your work relationships, in your dating relationships, right? Where you can be too aggressive or too timid because of guilt. And you've got to be so careful because guilt grows into something so much more sinister because you don't see it coming. Guilt evolves and grows and shows itself as anger. Man, and so often angry people don't make the connection between their anger and their guilt. And this is the great reason why we tend to either deny our guilt or stuff our guilt, because the only other option you're left with, right? If denying guilt's not a good idea and being defined by guilt is not a good idea, the only other option that you have left is to stand there condemned. We don't like that option, right? Because that leaves us there guilty and condemned, except for the good news of Jesus. See, Jesus comes in, and he actually gives us a third option that a guy named Paul writes about in a letter to the church at Rome. Romans 8:3, and we're going to work backwards through these verses. Romans 8:3 says this, the law, doesn't say that. Check this out. In your Bible, Romans 8:3 says this, the law of Moses was unable to save us because of the weakness of our sinful nature. Now, here's what Paul's saying here, because that seems like some fancy like church stuff. Really what Paul's saying here is the law can't save you. Right? For them, the law of Moses was like the 600 plus commands that they had to keep in order to show that they were loving God well. Right? And what Paul is saying is laws can't save us, and we know that. Right? Laws can't save us. The only thing laws do is point out where we mess up. The only thing laws do is just kind of highlight how low the bar is. It sets the bar. And once you go so low, once you go below that bar, all it does is point out, hey, you're guilty. You did that. And in some cases, it punishes you. And that's what Paul's saying. The law, it can't save you. And we know that. I mean, and then once you break that law, all it does is it takes you down this path of shame and guilt. Because, right, we know, because we've been there. We can't undrink too much. We can't be unfaithful. You can't give that childhood back. You can't go back and be a freshman again. You can't go back and redo that spring break trip. You can't go back and handle that meeting differently. But here's the good news. Because the rest of verse 3 says this, so God did what the law could not do. He, God, sent his own son in a body like the body we sinners have, and in that body God declared an end of sin's control over us by giving his son as a sacrifice for our sins. Paul says the law can't save us. It can show you where you messed up, but it cannot restore you. It cannot put you back in good standing. But Jesus can. And it leads to one of Paul's most emphatic verses. This is one of some of Jesus' followers, Christians' favorite verses in the entire Bible. Romans 8:1 says this, so there is now no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus. And here's the deal. I don't want you to read that as just words out of the Bible. I don't want you to read that as just like some holy text somewhere. I want you to read that as a man who probably experienced shame and guilt on a level that we could not even imagine. You see, Paul's story is Paul started out going after the church, killing Christians. And then later he realized what he was doing was wrong. Right? He acknowledges his guilt. He becomes a Jesus follower. He becomes a Christian, and he ends up becoming a leader in the church. And it is very likely that he wrote letters to churches, that he went and visited and preached at churches, and he preached to parents whose children he probably killed. It is very likely that Paul one day stood in a circle and prayed, holding the hands of a child whose parent he killed for being a follower of Jesus. Talking on a level of shame and guilt that we probably can't even imagine. And Paul says, I'll tell you what I experienced. When you place your faith in Christ Jesus, when you belong to Christ Jesus, there is now no condemnation. You're guilty, but you are not condemned. There is a place where we can exist where your past is neither forgotten nor condemning. For those who are willing to face their condemnation, acknowledge it in front of God, not deny it, not make excuses, not retreat to a narrative, but admit it and surrender to the lordship, the bossship of Jesus, we stand guilty, but not condemned. And because of that, we could regain our balance and then shut down the chatterbox. You see, the adversary, Satan, he will try and use your past to shame you, to shut you down, to try and tear you apart, to try and use it to define you. because he wants to keep you from experiencing what we call mercy. Mercy is you are guilty, but you are not condemned. There is now no shame for those who belong to Jesus. That is not who you are. It may be what you did, but that is not who you are. So here's the deal. 2 questions that I want to ask you this morning. And the first is, do I believe who God says I am? Do I believe who God says I am? God says, I love you. I want to have you in a relationship with me. You are my son, or you are my daughter. You were created with a purpose, and I love you. If you have not placed your trust and publicly declared Jesus to be your Lord and been baptized, what I want you to do is there's a yellow card on your seat. And I want you to mark on there, I want to know more about following Jesus. When you let Jesus be your leader, you lose your right to condemn yourself because you are not yours to condemn. And the second question I want to ask you is, do I believe God about who he is? Do I believe God about who he is? You see, once you experience that love and that forgiveness and being able to handle that guilt and that shame, God then turns us loose to go and love others as we have been loved. But that takes some faith in God. Right? If God is willing to forgive me, then I'm going to have to trust in him to help me go and forgive others. And so, we are now free. We're turned loose to go out and love the ones that we have hurt, to seek reconciliation for those we've hurt. Let me tell you what is not Christianity. Christianity is not, I hurt you, so I go and confess it to God, and now we're good. That's not Christianity. That's something else. Christianity is, I hurt you, but God's given me what I do not deserve by forgiving me, so the least that I could do is give you what you do deserve. I can't give you back what I took from you, but I'm sorry. The wise acknowledge and seek reconciliation. The band's going to come up and they're going to sing one more song after I pray. And what I want you to do is I want you to just meditate on the lyrics. I want you to meditate on the lyrics this morning. And the lyrics they're going to have us sing is, you, God, you say that I am loved when I can't feel a thing. Right? And shame will do that, right? Shame has got a really good way of keeping us from feeling loved. And it says, you say I am held when I have fallen short. That's grace. It says, when I feel like I don't belong, you say that I am yours. See, with Jesus, our guilt and our shame has no place. Like, yes, we did it. We acknowledge, Jesus, I messed up. But thank you for paying the debt for it. Thank you for dealing with my guilt, so that I no longer have to deny it, pretend like it didn't happen, because I know that's a lie, and I no longer have to be defined by it, but I can be defined as yours.